A routine stop at a gas station turned into a moment the world would never forget. When Big Shaq's mother was disrespected, the men laughing had no idea who was watching, until a black SUV rolled in. A 7-foot legend stepped out, and with just a few words, everything changed. This wasn't just a confrontation, it was a lesson in power, respect, and redemption. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The Florida sun hung high, casting long shadows over the streets of Orlando. It was the kind of day that felt peaceful, the kind where the world moved just a little slower. Shaquille O'Neal sat behind the wheel of his black SUV, his massive hands gripping the steering wheel with an ease that masked the strength behind them. The hum of the engine was steady, the road ahead smooth. But his mind was tangled in thoughts. Fame was a strange thing. It gave and it took. It built you up, made you larger than life. Yet somehow, it always reminded you that you were still just a man. Shaq had learned that lesson early. No matter how many millions he made, how many trophies he won, or how many people recognized his face, he was still the son of Lucille O'Neal, the woman who taught him respect, resilience, and the quiet power of walking away from ignorance. He tapped his fingers against the steering wheel as he pulled onto a familiar street. He had been meaning to stop by and check on his mother today. She was independent, stubborn even, always insisting she didn't need help. But Shaq had built his career on seeing plays before they happened, and he could see the future of a mother who was too proud to ask for anything. A soft chuckle rumbled from his chest as he thought about how she'd scold him for worrying too much. But that's what sons did. Especially sons who knew their mothers had already fought enough battles for them. A few blocks away, Lucille O'Neal was stepping out of her car, keys in hand, adjusting the strap of her purse. She moved with grace, with the confidence of a woman who had lived through storms and walked out on the other side, unshaken. The gas station she pulled into was one she had visited countless times before. It was convenient, a straight shot from her home. She had barely stepped toward the pump when she noticed something. A shift in the air. Subtle but distinct. It wasn't the Florida heat. It was the way the young clerk behind the counter barely looked at her. The way the man at the other pump gave her a sideways glance, his expression unreadable but laced with something she had seen before. Lucille wasn't new to this. She had been young in a world that wasn't always kind. She had raised a son in a world that made no promises. And now, standing at a gas station with nothing but the sound of the pump clicking into place, she felt it again, that unspoken, lingering weight. Shaq, still a few miles away, had no idea that his mother was already in the middle of a moment that would test everything she had ever taught him. He drove on, his mind drifting between the past and present. He thought about his childhood, about the lessons drilled into him by his stepfather, Philip Harrison. Stand tall, speak with respect, never forget where you came from. But what his mother had taught him was different. She had taught him that power wasn't just in his size. It was in his heart. It was in knowing when to fight and when to walk away. It was in understanding that some people saw his skin before they saw his soul. But that didn't mean he had to carry their ignorance. He reached for his phone at the red light, debating whether to call her and tell her he was on his way. But something held him back. He figured he'd surprise her. She liked surprises. At the gas station, Lucille finished fueling up, reaching into her purse for her card. That's when she heard it. A low voice, muttering, dismissive. Didn't think they came to this part of town. She paused for half a second before continuing. She had learned long ago that silence was often the loudest response. But then another voice joined in, a little bolder. A man in his late 40s, dressed in a work uniform, leaning against the hood of his truck. Wonder if she's paying with her own money or someone else's. Lucille's grip on her purse tightened, but her expression remained unreadable. She turned slowly, meeting the man's gaze with the quiet confidence of someone who had nothing to prove. "I beg your pardon?" The man smirked, shaking his head. "Just saying. You people always act like you own the place." For a split second, the world seemed to slow. The sound of passing cars faded. The sun felt hotter. The moment stretched, like the universe itself was watching to see what would happen next. Lucille took a deep breath, steady and unshaken. "Respect," she said simply, "is free." Shame you can't afford it. The man's smirk faltered, but before he could say another word, the unmistakable sound of tires rolling to a stop filled the air. A black SUV, large, familiar, and out stepped Shaquille O'Neal. The gas station fell silent. Lucille didn't need to turn around to know it was him. She felt his presence before she saw him. Shaq's steps were slow, deliberate. He didn't say a word at first, just let his height, his size, his very existence speak for him. The man in the work uniform shifted uncomfortably, glancing at Shaq, then back at Lucille. "You never know who's watching," Shaq said, his voice calm but firm. The man swallowed hard. He had plenty to say a minute ago. Now he wasn't so sure. Lucille, ever composed, sighed, and shook her head. "Shaquille, let's go." Shaq didn't take his eyes off the man. He didn't need to. The message was already sent. With a final glance, he turned, took the gas pump from his mother's hands, and swiped his card. "I got this, Ma," he said softly. Lucille allowed herself a small smile. Not because she needed his money, but because she knew what this moment meant to him. Shaq was no longer the boy she raised. He was a man who had learned when to walk away and when to stand his ground. As they pulled out of the station, Shaq caught the man's reflection in the side mirror. He was still standing there, looking smaller than before. The day was still bright. The world still moved. But something had shifted. And Shaq? Shaq wasn't done yet. The afternoon heat pressed against the pavement as Lucille O'Neal pulled her car into the gas station. The small, locally owned station sat at the edge of town, tucked between an old hardware store and a row of faded buildings that had seen better days. She had stopped here plenty of times before, never giving it much thought. Today, however, something felt different. As she stepped out of her car, she adjusted the strap of her purse and smoothed the front of her blouse, her movements calm and composed. She had always carried herself with quiet dignity, an elegance that had nothing to do with wealth or status, but everything to do with self-respect. It was a trait she had passed down to her son, a lesson she had hoped would shield him from a world that sometimes refused to see past the color of his skin. Inside the gas station, behind the counter, a young man named Derek barely lifted his head as Lucille approached the pump. He was in his early 20s, lanky, and unimpressed by just about everything. He had worked here for 2 years and had developed a sharp sense of who belonged and who didn't. As soon as he saw Lucille, something in his posture shifted. He exhaled slowly, shaking his head. Near the entrance, 3 men stood in a loose circle, chatting among themselves. One of them, Brent Calloway, leaned against a red pickup truck, his arms crossed over his chest. He was in his late 40s, tall, with a frame that suggested he had once been strong, but had since let time soften him. His eyes, sharp and calculating, landed on Lucille with an expression that was neither welcoming nor indifferent. She felt it immediately, the weight of their stares. Lucille had lived long enough to recognize moments like this before they even fully formed. They always started the same way, a glance that lasted a second too long, a whisper just loud enough to be heard but not understood. It was never the words that struck first. It was the tone, the smirk, the shared amusement between men who thought their presence alone was enough to diminish hers. She slid her credit card into the pump and pressed the button for premium gas, keeping her focus steady. Ignoring them was easy enough. She had spent a lifetime learning how. Brent turned his head slightly toward Derek behind the counter and muttered something under his breath. Derek snorted, shaking his head with amusement. Lucille caught it, but she didn't react. She had seen these kinds of men before, men who had inherited the same bitterness their fathers carried, men who confused disrespect for strength. Brent pushed away from the truck and took a slow step forward, rubbing the back of his neck like he was debating whether or not to speak. Then, with a smirk, he decided, "Didn't think people like you came to this part of town." Lucille didn't look at him, didn't acknowledge him. She kept her hand steady on the gas pump, watching the numbers climb. Brent exchanged a glance with one of his friends, emboldened by her silence. "Must be nice," he continued, "driving around in a fancy car like that. Bet you don't even pump your own gas most days, huh?" The other 2 men chuckled. Derek, behind the counter, pretended to be focused on his work, but the slight smirk on his face betrayed him. Lucille exhaled slowly, steadying herself. She wasn't a stranger to moments like this. But it never got easier. Brent took another step forward, close enough now that the scent of cigarette smoke and motor oil clung to the air between them. Funny, ain't it? He mused. Some folks work their whole lives and barely get by. And then there's folks like you who just... He snapped his fingers. Get lucky. Lucille let the silence sit between them for a beat longer, before finally turning to face him. Her expression was unreadable, but there was something in her eyes. Something that made Brent's smirk falter just slightly. Respect, she said evenly, is free. Shame you can't afford it. Brent's friends chuckled under their breath, but he didn't appreciate the joke. His smirk flattened, his jaw tightening. Meanwhile, just a few feet away, a black SUV rolled into the station, pulling up near the air pump. The driver didn't immediately step out. Shaquille O'Neal sat in the driver's seat, one hand resting on the wheel, the other adjusting the radio. He had stopped here on a whim, planning to grab a bottle of water before heading to his mother's house. But as he glanced toward the pumps, something caught his eye. His mother. And she wasn't alone. Shaq's gaze flickered toward the group of men. The body language, the way they stood just close enough to make a point. The look on his mother's face. Calm, unreadable, but firm. He knew that look. He had seen it when he was a kid, when a teacher had underestimated him. He had seen it when she spoke about the struggles of the past, about how things had been different for her, harder. And he had seen it when she told him in no uncertain terms that no amount of money or fame would ever change the way some people saw him. Shaq turned the engine off and stepped out. The moment he did, the energy in the station shifted. He was a presence, a force, a giant moving with deliberate calm. He didn't say a word at first. He didn't need to. Brent, who had been so bold just seconds ago, noticed him immediately. His smirk returned, but it wasn't as steady as before. Well, I'll be damned, Brent said, stuffing his hands into his pockets. Look who it is. Shaq's eyes never left him. Lucille, still poised, still calm, turned to her son. Shaquille, it's fine. Let's go. Shaq nodded, but his eyes stayed locked on Brent. He didn't raise his voice, didn't take a single step forward. But when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone who had seen this play out before. You never know who's watching. Brent exhaled sharply through his nose, shaking his head. Ain't nobody scared of you, big guy. Shaq tilted his head slightly, considering him. Then, without breaking eye contact, he reached into his pocket, pulled out his card and handed it to his mother. I got this, Ma. Lucille took it without a word, swiping the card. The only sound was the beep of the transaction processing. The moment stretched, heavy and loaded. Brent shifted on his feet, suddenly aware of how quiet everything had gotten. His friends weren't laughing anymore. Derek, behind the counter, looked down, suddenly finding something to clean. Shaq finally blinked, as if dismissing the moment altogether. Then, in the same calm, measured way he had arrived, he turned toward his SUV. Lucille followed, her back straight, her presence unwavering. As they drove off, Shaq glanced in the rearview mirror. Brent was still standing there, hands in his pockets, staring after them. For the first time, he looked small. A stillness settled over the gas station, thick as the afternoon heat. The murmur of passing traffic seemed distant now, drowned out by something heavier, something unspoken. Shaquille O'Neal stood beside his SUV, his frame casting a shadow longer than the truck parked beside him. He didn't need to speak. He didn't need to move. His presence alone did what words never could. Brent Calloway, standing a few feet away, shifted his weight, forcing a smirk that didn't quite reach his eyes. His two friends, who had been laughing moments ago, had gone quiet. And inside the station behind the counter, Derek gripped the register a little tighter, his fingers pressing into the buttons, as if bracing himself for something he couldn't control. Lucille O'Neal, still composed, still steady, glanced at her son out of the corner of her eye. She had raised this man. She knew his heart. And she knew that right now, he was choosing to be still. Choosing to let the weight of his silence speak for him. Shaq's gaze never left Brent, Not threatening, not angry, just watching. The thing about silence, the thing about presence, was that it had a way of forcing people to confront themselves. And right now, Brent was standing in front of a mirror he didn't ask for. The seconds stretched, long enough for doubt to creep in. "You got something to say?" Brent finally asked, tilting his chin up. His voice was steady, but his stance betrayed him. His feet shifted, his shoulders tensed. Shaq said nothing. Derek swallowed hard, rubbing the back of his neck. He had seen Shaq on TV, seen him in commercials, seen him laughing, larger than life. But this was different. This wasn't the playful giant people loved to watch. This was something else, something immovable. Brent cleared his throat, glancing at his friends for backup. Neither of them said a word. One of them took half a step back, just enough to create space between them. "You're making a big deal out of nothing, man," Brent muttered, forcing a chuckle. "We were just talking." Still, Shaq didn't respond, didn't blink, didn't flinch. Lucille, patient as ever, exhaled softly. She knew this wasn't about pride. This wasn't about making a statement. This was about something deeper. Finally, Shaq moved. Not toward Brent, not toward the gas station clerk, toward his mother. His steps were slow, deliberate. His massive hand reached out, not in aggression, but in quiet acknowledgement. He placed it gently on her shoulder, a silent reminder. "I see you. I stand with you." Lucille, strong as she was, let the moment settle. She didn't need protection. She never had. But there was something in the way her son stood beside her that made the air shift even more. Brent exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "Look, man, Shaq finally spoke. His voice was low, calm, and steady. "You never know who's watching." Brent hesitated, the weight of those words hanging between them. It wasn't just a statement. It was a warning. A truth. Derek looked down at the register, suddenly avoiding eye contact. The other two men who had stood beside Brent only moments ago seemed smaller now, their confidence unraveling under the weight of something they couldn't name. Brent scoffed, stuffing his hands in his pockets. "Ain't nobody scared of you," he muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. Shaq tilted his head slightly, still calm, still watching. Then, without another word, he reached into his pocket, pulled out his card, and handed it to his mother. "I got this, Ma," he said softly. Lucille took it without hesitation. The gas station was silent as the transaction processed, the beep of the card reader the only sound in the air. Shaq didn't spare another glance at Brent. He didn't need to. The moment had already passed. The lesson had already been delivered. As Lucille climbed back into her car, Shaq followed, his every move deliberate, unhurried. They pulled away from the gas station, leaving behind a man who, for the first time, looked uncertain. Looked small. A heavy silence blanketed the gas station. It was the kind of silence that didn't feel empty. It felt full, charged, like the air before a thunderstorm. Shaquille O'Neal stood still, his massive frame a wall of unshaken calm. He hadn't shouted. He hadn't moved aggressively. And yet, the weight of his presence was suffocating for the men who had, just moments ago, been so comfortable in their disrespect. Brent Calloway felt it the most. He had been the loudest, the boldest, the first to smirk, the first to mock. But now, under Shaq's unwavering stare, something inside him wavered. For the first time, Brent wasn't in control of the room. Shaq's eyes locked onto him, steady and knowing, like he had already measured every inch of Brent's character in a single glance. "You never know who's watching," Shaq said, his voice low but firm. The words didn't need to be loud to be heard. They carried a weight that settled deep in the pit of Brent's stomach. He forced a scoff, shaking his head. "Man, please. What, you think you're some kind of hero?" The smirk was back, but it wasn't real. It was a mask, a flimsy one, barely holding up under the pressure of the moment. Shaq didn't answer. He didn't need to. Behind the counter, Derek, the gas station clerk, shifted uncomfortably. He had been enjoying the show earlier, smirking along with Brent, but now it didn't feel so funny. Now there were too many eyes, too much quiet judgment pressing down on him. The customers inside the gas station, previously uninterested, had started to take notice. Some of them were pretending to browse the shelves, but their eyes flickered toward the scene outside, their curiosity undeniable. A woman near the coffee machine whispered to the man beside her, nodding toward Shaq and Brent. Another man, standing near the entrance, folded his arms and leaned against the glass, watching with quiet interest. Brent felt the shift, felt the way the room was turning. He had been in situations like this before, where he and his friends laughed at someone, made a few jokes, threw a few careless words into the air. And usually, those moments passed without consequence. Usually the world moved on, and people forgot. But this was different. Because this wasn't just some random woman at a gas station. This was Shaquille O'Neal's mother. And Shaquille O'Neal was standing right in front of him. Lucille O'Neal, ever composed, exhaled softly, glancing at her son. "Shaquille," she said gently, "let's go." Shaq didn't move right away. He let the moment linger, let the weight of his silence sink in just a little deeper. Then, finally, he reached into his pocket, pulled out his card and handed it to his mother. "I got this, Ma," he said, his voice soft but firm. Lucille nodded, taking the card without hesitation. She understood what this moment was, understood what it meant for her son. She swiped the card at the pump, the beep of the machine cutting through the tension like a blade. Brent exhaled sharply, glancing at his friends, but neither of them met his eyes. The laughter was gone. The bravado had faded. Derek, behind the counter, looked down, suddenly finding something to fix on the register. Shaq turned, guiding his mother back toward her car, but just as he reached for the handle, he paused. The moment stretched. The tension thickened. Then, without looking back, Shaq spoke one final time. "You're lucky," he said. Brent blinked. "Lucky?" Shaq nodded once. "Lucky I'm not the kind of man you think I am." Brent didn't have a response for that. He couldn't. Shaq opened the car door, waiting for his mother to settle in before walking around to his side. As he slid behind the wheel, he gave one last glance in the rearview mirror. Brent was still standing there, hands in his pockets, his smirk completely gone. The world outside the gas station kept moving. Cars drove by, people came and went. But for the people who had witnessed what had just happened, something had changed. Because sometimes, the loudest moments weren't the ones filled with shouting. Sometimes, the most powerful thing a man could do was simply stand his ground. The hum of the engine was steady as Shaquille O'Neal drove down the highway, his mother seated beside him. The gas station was already behind them, just another stop in the day. Lucille O'Neal sat with quiet dignity, gazing out the window, the weight of the moment still lingering in the air between them. Shaq glanced at her. "You okay, Ma?" Lucille nodded, her expression unreadable. "I've been through worse, Shaquille." This question mark. This is nothing new. Shaq knew that. He hated that he knew that. The rest of their drive was quiet, both of them lost in their own thoughts. To Shaq, it was just another example of the world his mother had learned to navigate with grace. To Lucille, it was a reminder that even after all these years, some things never changed. What neither of them realized was that, just minutes after they left, the incident was no longer just theirs to remember. Inside the gas station, Derek stood behind the counter, tapping his fingers anxiously against the register. He could feel the tension still lingering, like a bad taste in the air. Brent was outside, pacing beside his truck, his jaw tight, his fists clenching and unclenching. His two friends had already left, eager to distance themselves from what had just happened. And then there was the quiet customer, the man who had been browsing the snack aisle when it all went down. The one who hadn't said a word, but had seen everything. He wasn't from around here. He had just stopped for a drink, intending to get back on the road within minutes. But as he stood in line, watching Brent smirk, hearing the way he spoke to Lucille O'Neal, something in him told him to pull out his phone. And he recorded. Not the entire exchange, but enough. Enough to show Brent's smug arrogance, the shift in his demeanor when Shaq stepped out of the SUV, the suffocating silence that followed. The video caught the way Brent tried to laugh it off, the moment Shaq spoke those final words. "You never know who's watching." And as soon as the customer left the gas station, He uploaded it. By the time Shaq and Lucille pulled into their next stop, the video had already been shared hundreds of times. Within an hour, it had crossed state lines. By nightfall, it had gone viral. Social media exploded. Twitter threads dissected every second of the footage. News outlets picked it up, attaching bold headlines. Racial tension at Florida gas station. Shaquille O'Neal responds without a single punch. Big Shaq's mother disrespected. See how he handled it. A lesson in presence, when words aren't necessary. Comment sections flooded with debates. Some praised Shaq's restraint. Others questioned how an old story like this could still exist in America. Some tried to defend Brent, claiming it was just a misunderstanding, but the video didn't lie. The internet had chosen its side. And Brent Calloway. He wasn't ready for what was coming. The next morning, Brent arrived at the gas station expecting things to blow over. This wasn't the first time he had mouthed off. It wouldn't be the last. People in town knew him. They weren't exactly saints either. But as soon as he walked in, he felt it. The eyes, the whispers, the weight of being seen for what he really was. A customer, a woman in her early 40s, shot him a look of disgust as she walked past. A young man near the coffee machine shook his head and muttered, "Unbelievable." Even Derek, the same clerk who had laughed along with him the day before, now looked uncomfortable, like standing too close to Brent would taint him by association. And then the worst part. The gas station owner, his boss, was waiting for him, arms crossed. "Brent," he said, voice tight. "Step into my office." Brent swallowed hard. Derek, meanwhile, had problems of his own. The video had caught his expression, the smirk, the way he had stayed silent when it mattered. The internet had done its thing, tracking down the gas station, identifying employees. Derek's name was floating around, attached to words like complicit and part of the problem. He had spent the entire morning deleting comments from his social media, but the damage was already done. The town wasn't big enough for him to hide. Shaq had no idea any of this was happening. His day had continued like normal. Meetings, calls, a few laughs over dinner with his mother. It wasn't until his phone started buzzing, relentless, non-stop, that he realized something was going on. A text from an old teammate. "Yo, you seen this video?" A missed call from a reporter. Another text, this time from a friend in media. "Man, you're trending. Call me." Shaq frowned, unlocking his phone. He tapped the link someone had sent him and watched as the video loaded. His own face stared back at him. The moment at the gas station, the silent tension, his final words. He sighed, rubbing his temple. He wasn't surprised. He had been in the public eye long enough to know that cameras were everywhere, that nothing truly stayed private. Lucille, sitting across from him at the table, noticed his expression. "What is it?" Shaq hesitated before turning the phone around. "Someone filmed it," he said simply. Lucille took the phone, watching as the clip played. When it ended, she placed it on the table and exhaled. "Well," she said, "I suppose it was only a matter of time." Shaq leaned back in his chair. "You want me to say something?" Lucille thought for a moment, then shook her head. "Number you already said enough." He nodded. He trusted his mother's wisdom more than he trusted the internet's outrage. But even as they continued their evening, as they moved on with their day, Shaq knew one thing for certain. The ripple had already started, and there was no telling how far it would reach. Brent Calloway had spent most of his life believing he was untouchable. His town was small, his reputation solid, at least in the circles that mattered to him. He was the kind of man who could say something offhanded, something cruel, and still shake hands at Sunday service without consequence. But now, consequence had arrived. By the next morning, his name wasn't just being whispered around town. It was everywhere. Local news stations had picked up the story, digging deeper into who Brent Calloway really was. And what they found wasn't just an isolated incident. It was a pattern. Old complaints resurfaced. Moments people had tried to forget or had been too afraid to speak on. A former co-worker at the auto shop where Brent used to work came forward, recalling how he had once refused to service a black customer's car, muttering something under his breath as he walked away. A former high school classmate told reporters about how Brent had made jokes that weren't really jokes. Comments about who deserved to be in his town, who was getting too comfortable. The internet, relentless in its pursuit, uncovered something deeper. Brent's father, a man who had died years ago, had been the same way. And his grandfather? Even worse. There were old newspaper clippings, barely preserved, detailing his grandfather's involvement in protests against desegregation in the 1960s. A family history of hate, passed down like an heirloom. And now, Brent had to face the truth. His past wasn't just knocking. It had kicked down the door. Brent walked into the gas station that morning expecting things to be tense, but he hadn't expected this. The second he stepped inside, every conversation stopped. Derek, the same gas station clerk who had laughed along with him just a day ago, barely made eye contact. An older man near the coffee machine shook his head and muttered, "Disgraceful." A woman, someone Brent had known for years, shot him a look so sharp it cut right through him. The owner of the gas station was waiting for him behind the counter, his arms crossed tight against his chest. "Brent," he said flatly, "you can't work here no more." Brent stiffened. "What?" "You heard me," the owner said. "People are calling, threatening to boycott the station. I got no choice." Brent scoffed. "This is ridiculous." The owner didn't blink. "You did it to yourself." For the first time, Brent felt something unfamiliar creeping in. Fear. He turned to Derek, expecting backup. But Derek just looked away, suddenly very interested in the buttons on the register. Brent clenched his jaw. "This is all over a damn video? I didn't do anything illegal." The owner exhaled sharply. "Brent, just go." Brent stood there for a long moment, his fists clenching and unclenching. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out, the bell above the door ringing behind him. For the first time in his life, Brent Calloway felt small. Shaquille O'Neal sat in his mother's living room, staring at his phone. The messages kept coming. Calls from reporters, texts from old friends, even NBA teammates checking in. The video was still spreading, but now it wasn't just about what had happened at the gas station. It had evolved into something bigger, something Shaq wasn't sure he wanted to be a part of. His mother sat across from him, watching him carefully. "You've been quiet all morning," she said. Shaq exhaled, setting his phone down. "I don't know, Ma. Feels like a lot." Lucille nodded knowingly. "It is a lot." Shaq rubbed his hands together, staring down at them. "It's not the first time I've seen something like that. It won't be the last." Lucille tilted her head. "But it's the first time the world has seen it happen to me." Shaq looked up, his mother's words settling into his chest like a weight. She wasn't wrong. He had spent his whole life in the public eye, dealing with moments like this in small ways, in private spaces. But this time it was different. This time, he couldn't ignore it. Lucille leaned forward. "You know, when you were a boy, I used to pray you'd grow up strong. Not just in size, but in heart. I knew the world wouldn't always be kind to you. I knew you'd see things I never wanted you to see. But I also knew you'd have a choice. Stay silent or stand up." Shaq swallowed hard. "I don't know if I want to get involved, Ma." Lucille studied him for a moment, then gave him a small smile. "Baby, you already are." Shaq let the words settle. Because she was right. The past had come knocking, not just for Brent Calloway, but for him too. And the question was, what was he going to do about it? Brent Calloway sat in his truck, gripping the steering wheel so tight his knuckles turned white. The world he knew. The world where he could say what he wanted, do what he wanted, and never face consequences, was collapsing around him. The gas station had cut him loose. The auto shop where he picked up side work told him not to come back. Even his sister, who had always defended him, had called that morning, her voice sharp with disappointment. "What the hell were you thinking, Brent?" He tried to explain, to tell her it was all being blown out of proportion, but she wasn't having it. "You messed with the wrong person, and now you're paying for it." And the worst part? She was right. The town wasn't standing behind him like he thought they would. Some people had gone silent. Others outright distanced themselves. And online, his name was Dirt. The anger built inside him, tightening his chest. All because of Shaquille O'Neal. Brent stared at the headlines flashing across his phone screen. Shaq's silence speaks volumes. Racist gas station incident exposes deep-rooted hate in small town. Brent Calloway, a symbol of the problem? His teeth clenched. He wasn't a symbol. He was a man who had made a joke, that's all. And now his life was ruined? He needed to do something. Something big. Then he saw it. A breaking news report. Shaquille O'Neal had been invited to do a live interview that night on a major news network. The host was planning to discuss the viral video, race relations, and accountability. And that's when Brent made up his mind. If Shaq was going to talk about him on national television, then Brent was going to show up and tell his side of the story. The studio was buzzing. The show was set to go live in 5 minutes. Shaq sat in the green room, calm but thoughtful. His mother's words from earlier still echoed in his mind. "You already are involved, baby." He had agreed to the interview not because he wanted to fuel the fire, but because he wanted to shift the conversation. He wasn't here to tear anyone down. He was here to build something better. But outside, chaos was brewing. Brent had called in a favor from an old friend in media, demanding to be let inside. He wasn't going to sit back while Shaq painted him as a villain. Security hesitated, but before they could fully block him, the host of the show, seeing the chance for explosive television, gave the green light. Let him in. The cameras rolled. The lights dimmed slightly as the host welcomed Shaq to the program. "Shaquille, thank you for being here tonight." Shaq nodded. "Appreciate you having me." The host leaned forward. "You've stayed pretty quiet despite the massive conversation surrounding that gas station video. Why is that?" Shaq exhaled, choosing his words carefully. "Because I don't believe in yelling just to be heard. People react to moments like this with anger, with outrage. I get it. But I don't want to add to the noise. I want to add to the solution." The host nodded, intrigued. "And what is the solution?" Before Shaq could answer, a voice cut through. The studio. "This is ridiculous." A murmur spread through the audience as the camera swung toward the commotion. Brent Calloway was standing at the edge of the stage, microphone in hand, his face red with frustration. Shaq didn't flinch. The host, stunned but recognizing the media gold in front of him, hesitated for only a second before gesturing toward Brent. "Well, it looks like we have an unexpected guest. Brent Calloway, ladies and gentlemen." Brent stepped forward, shoulders squared, trying to regain the confidence he once had. "This whole thing is blown out of proportion," he snapped. "I've lost my job. My family's embarrassed. And for what? A misunderstanding." Shaq remained still, his eyes locked on Brent, analyzing, waiting. Brent turned toward the audience, his voice rising. "This isn't about racism. This is about a man with power." He jabbed a finger at Shaq, using his fame to ruin a regular guy's life. A hushed silence fell over the room. Shaq leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees. "You think I ruined your life, Brent?" Brent huffed. "Didn't you?" Shaq let the question hang for a beat before answering. "No, Brent. You did." Brent opened his mouth, but Shaq wasn't done. "You want to talk about power?" Shaq's voice was calm, steady. "Power isn't about size. It isn't about money. It's about choices. And you made yours." Brent's jaw tightened, but Shaq pressed on. "You see, people like you. You think respect is something you can decide who deserves and who doesn't. You speak to people like my mother the way you did because you thought no one was watching. But now the world saw it. And that's not my fault, Brent." The audience was dead silent. Brent's frustration cracked, his voice losing its edge. "So what, you think I can't change?" Shaq studied him for a long moment before answering. "I think everyone can change. But it starts with owning what you did. Not blaming me. Not blaming the internet. Owning it." Brent swallowed hard. The host, sensing the shift in the air, leaned in. "Shaq, what do you hope comes from all of this?" Shaq exhaled. "I hope people understand that words matter, that respect matters, that power isn't about who can shout the loudest. It's about who can stand firm in the truth. A few members of the audience clapped softly. The ripple grew, spreading through the room. The host turned back to Brent. "And you, Brent? What do you want to say now?" Brent hesitated. His pride was fighting him, but the weight of the moment was pressing down on his shoulders. For the first time, he didn't have a snarky response. He looked at Shaq, then at the cameras, then at the floor. I don't know." Shaq nodded once. "That's a start." The show ended moments later, but the conversation was just beginning. By the next morning, the headlines weren't just about Brent Calloway's past. They were about accountability, redemption, and the moment a nation watched a giant stand, not to fight, but to teach. Brent Calloway had always believed the world worked a certain way. People like him stuck with their own, said what they wanted, and never worried about the consequences. He had lived that way for years, carrying the same attitudes passed down from his father and grandfather. But now, everything had changed. The fallout from the gas station incident and the live confrontation with Shaquille O'Neal had left him isolated. He had lost his job. His name was dragged through the mud. His so-called friends avoided him. Even family gatherings had turned uncomfortable, filled with long silences and sharp looks. At first, Brent was furious. He convinced himself that he was the victim, that Shaq had used his fame to destroy him, that the internet had overreacted, twisting the situation into something bigger than it really was. But the longer he sat with it, the harder it became to ignore the truth. The world hadn't changed. He was just being seen for who he had always been. And now he didn't know what to do with that realization. Meanwhile, Shaq and Lucille had moved on, or at least tried to. Shaq had returned to his routine, balancing business deals, charity work, and his usual media appearances. But no matter how many meetings or interviews he sat through, something about the gas station incident stayed with him. Not because it was new, because it wasn't. Because his mother had endured things like that for decades. Because people like Brent Calloway existed in every town, in every corner of the country. Because no amount of money, no amount of fame, could erase the reality of what they had experienced. Lucille, ever composed, had brushed it off. "It's just the way things are," she had told him. But Shaq wasn't satisfied with that answer. Because if things were always going to be this way, then what was all his success even for? That thought lingered in the back of his mind, restless and unresolved. And then, one day, an unexpected visitor arrived. Shaq was leaving a community center after hosting an event for at-risk youth when a young man hesitantly approached him. Shaq noticed him immediately. Tall, thin, maybe in his early 20s. There was something familiar about his face. The young man swallowed nervously before speaking. "Mr. O'Neal, I don't know if you know who I am." Shaq studied him for a second, then nodded. "You're Brent Calloway's brother. Aaron Calloway, Brent's younger sibling, the one who had always stayed in the background, quiet and overlooked." Aaron nodded quickly. "Yeah, look, He took a deep breath. "I wanted to talk to you." Shaq crossed his arms, watching him carefully. "Go ahead." Aaron hesitated, then spoke in a rush, like he had been holding it in for too long. "I know what my brother did was wrong. I know what he said, how he acted, and I know what people are saying about him." He looked down, shaking his head. "But the truth is, Brent's not the only one in my family who thinks like that. That's just how we were raised." Shaq didn't respond, letting Aaron continue. "But I don't want to be like that," Aaron said, his voice tightening. "I don't want to carry that hate, that ignorance. I don't want to be the next Brent." Shaq studied him, his expression unreadable. He had met plenty of people who claimed they wanted to change, but most didn't mean it. Aaron shifted uncomfortably. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do, how I'm supposed to unlearn all of it, but I figured if there was anyone who could point me in the right direction, it'd be you." Shaq exhaled slowly. This was it. This was the difference between fighting the past and investing in the future. "You serious about this?" Shaq finally asked. Aaron nodded. "Yeah." Shaq glanced at the community center behind him. "Then let's start here." Over the next few weeks, Shaq introduced Aaron to programs that focused on education, mentorship, and breaking generational cycles of prejudice. Aaron started volunteering, working with kids who came from different backgrounds than his own. He listened, he learned, he changed. It wasn't easy. Every day was a battle against the beliefs he had grown up with, against the family members who still whispered behind his back, saying he was betraying his own people. But he kept going, because for the first time, Aaron saw the world through his own eyes, not the ones his family had forced on him. And Shaq? Shaq saw hope. One night, Brent sat alone in his small apartment, flipping through channels absent-mindedly. He had been avoiding the news, avoiding anything that reminded him of what his life had become. But then, his brother's face flashed across the screen. It was a local news segment, a feature on the community center where Aaron had been volunteering. Brent froze, gripping the remote. There was Aaron speaking with kids, laughing, helping. And then, an interview. Aaron looked into the camera, his expression serious. I used to think like my brother, but I realized it's not about who's right or wrong. It's about who's willing to learn, who's willing to change. Brent's chest tightened. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. His own brother, the kid he had always ignored, always brushed off, was sitting on TV, talking about how he was trying to be better. And the worst part? He actually sounded like he meant it. For the first time since the incident, Brent didn't feel anger. He felt something else, something heavier. Brent didn't reach out to Aaron right away. He didn't call Shaq. He didn't suddenly transform overnight, but he started thinking. Really thinking. And late one night, long after the news segment had faded from the headlines, Brent sat at his kitchen table, staring at his phone. After what felt like an eternity, he finally picked it up and typed out a message. To Aaron. I saw you on TV. Guess I got some catching up to do. He hovered over the send button. Then finally, he pressed it. Maybe, just maybe, change wasn't impossible after all. The lights of the community center glowed against the cool evening air, casting a warm, welcoming presence over the crowd gathered outside. It was Shaquille O'Neal's annual charity event, an evening dedicated to raising money for youth programs, education, sports, mentorship. The kind of event that didn't just raise funds, but built futures. Inside, the energy buzzed with laughter, conversation, and the occasional flash of cameras. People from all walks of life filled the space. Athletes, local leaders, students, and families. The smell of catered food mixed with the sound of music playing softly over the speakers. Shaq moved through the crowd like he always did, shaking hands, offering hugs, stopping to listen to a kid tell him about his dreams of making it to the NBA. He loved these nights, because nights like these were proof that change was possible. What he didn't know, what no one expected, was that change was about to walk through the door. Brent Calloway stood outside the community center, staring at the entrance. His truck was parked down the street, his hands buried deep in his jacket pockets as he watched people come and go. He didn't know why he had come, or maybe he did. Maybe it was the weeks of silence, the slow unraveling of everything he thought he knew. Maybe it was seeing his brother Aaron change before his very eyes, hearing him speak words that made Brent feel things he wasn't ready to admit. Or maybe it was because, for the first time in his life, Brent realized that he was the villain in his own story, and he didn't want to be. He exhaled sharply, rolling his shoulders back. Just go in, Calloway. One foot in front of the other. He stepped inside. The moment Brent entered, the mood in the room shifted. People noticed him. Conversations slowed. Some stopped entirely. A few guests exchanged looks, whispering to each other. They recognized him. From the video, from the headlines, from the shameful story that had spread like wildfire. But Brent didn't look at them. His eyes scanned the room, searching for one person. And then, across the crowd, he found him. Shaq. The giant stood near the stage, laughing with a group of kids, his towering frame relaxed, his presence effortless. Brent swallowed hard, his pulse hammering in his ears. This was it. No turning back now. Shaq felt the shift in energy before he even turned around. A weight in the air. A presence that didn't quite belong. When he finally did turn, his gaze locked onto Brent. For a second, neither of them moved. Brent's mouth felt dry, his legs heavier than they should have been. He took a step forward, then another, until the space between them was gone. People around them watched. No one spoke. Brent cleared his throat, his voice rough, uncertain. Hey, can we talk? Shaq studied him, his expression unreadable. Then, with a slow nod, he motioned for Brent to follow him toward a quieter corner of the room. Brent hesitated only a second before walking after him. The noise of the event faded as the two men stood face to face. Brent took a deep breath. Look, I don't expect you to believe me when I say this, but I came here because I needed to. He shifted on his feet. I messed up, man. And not just at that gas station. A lot of places. A lot of times. Shaq listened, his face calm but unreadable. Brent exhaled sharply. I was raised a certain way, taught to think certain things. I never questioned it. I never even thought about it. But then, all of this happened. And for the first time, I had to actually sit with it. And I didn't like what I saw. He looked down, rubbing the back of his neck. I hurt people. I disrespected your mother. And I disrespected you. I thought I was better than I was. And now I see it. His voice dropped lower. I don't expect forgiveness. Hell, I don't even know if I deserve it, but I just wanted you to hear it from me. I'm sorry. The words hung between them. Shaq took a slow breath. His massive arms still crossed over his chest. His mother's voice echoed in his mind. You already are involved, baby. He had learned long ago that people like Brent didn't just wake up and change. Change took time. It took effort. And it wasn't words that proved it. It was actions. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Shaq spoke. Do you mean it? Brent didn't hesitate. Yeah, I do. Shaq studied him, looking for any hint of insincerity. Then slowly, he nodded. Good. Now prove it. Brent's eyebrows furrowed. What do you mean? Shaq motioned toward the stage, where Aaron was helping some kids at a booth. Your brother's been putting in the work. You willing to do the same? Brent followed Shaq's gaze, watching Aaron laugh with a young boy. He swallowed hard. He had never understood his brother before. But now maybe he wanted to. Brent nodded once. Yeah, I am. Shaq didn't offer a handshake. He didn't pat him on the back, he just gave him a single simple nod. Because redemption wasn't given. It was earned. Brent didn't fix everything that night. He didn't suddenly become a new person. But he took a step toward something better. As the night continued, Shaq watched Brent from a distance, seeing him approach Aaron, seeing the tentative, uncertain exchange between two brothers who had never truly seen each other before. Lucille O'Neill stood beside her son, watching quietly. That was big of you, she murmured. Shaq exhaled. Nah, it's up to him now. She smiled. Yes, but you gave him the chance to try. Shaq didn't respond, just nodded. Because at the end of the day, this wasn't about winning or losing. It wasn't about revenge. It was about breaking cycles. About proving that while hatred is taught, redemption is earned. And sometimes the greatest power wasn't in fighting. It was in standing tall and giving others the chance to do the same. Some lessons aren't taught. They're lived. Some moments don't just go viral, they spark change. The real question isn't what Shaq did that day. It's what you would do, because silence is a choice. Action is another. And in a world where you never know who's watching, which one will you make?